People don't freeze to death all at once. First, the storm convinces them to stop moving. Ethan Walker heard those words 15 years earlier from an old trapper in northern Alaska, but now, alone inside a white blizzard with no horizon, no light, and no feeling left in his hands, he finally understood what the man meant. The cold was not loud. It did not attack like an animal. It whispered. It told exhausted people to sit down, to close their eyes, to rest for just a minute. Ethan staggered through snow that reached past his knees, his boots sinking deeper with every step as freezing wind clawed across the mountainside at nearly 70 miles an hour. Somewhere behind the endless white curtain was the hunting trail he had followed that morning, but the storm had swallowed it hours ago. Now there was only snow, wind, and silence so deep it felt like the world itself had disappeared. Ethan could barely see anymore. Snow blindness had turned everything into blurred shadows and burning light. Every blink felt like sand scraping across his eyes. He wiped frozen tears from his face with trembling fingers, but it changed nothing. The storm had stolen the sky from him. He checked the cracked compass hanging from his coat, but the needle spun uselessly in circles. Dead, just like the radio clipped to his shoulder, just like the flashlight buried somewhere beneath the snow after his last fall. Ethan's breathing turned ragged as he forced himself up another icy slope. Frost covered his beard so heavily that his jaw barely moved when he tried to speak. "Keep moving," he whispered to himself. But even his own voice sounded far away now. The temperature had dropped to nearly minus 71 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Ethan knew the signs too well. The numbness spreading through his legs, the heaviness in his thoughts, the dangerous calm creeping into his chest. His body was shutting down. Somewhere deep inside the storm, a tree cracked loudly like a rifle shot, followed by another. The mountain was freezing alive around him. Ethan stumbled again and crashed hard into the snow. This time, he stayed there longer than before. The cold beneath him felt strangely soft, comfortable. His eyelids drooped as the wind screamed overhead. He imagined the cabin fireplace back home in Montana. Warm coffee, dry blankets, the sound of rain hitting the roof in summer. For a terrifying moment, he forgot where he was. Then he heard it. One heavy wing beat. Ethan's eyes opened slowly. Another wing beat followed somewhere ahead in the white darkness. Deep, rhythmic, too large to belong to any bird he knew. He pushed himself onto one elbow, listening carefully. The sound came again. Flap, silence. Flap, silence. Not random, controlled, almost deliberate. Ethan squinted into the storm, but the snow erased everything beyond a few feet. "Hello," he called weakly, though he wasn't sure why. The wind swallowed the word instantly. Then, through the white haze, a shape appeared for only a second. Dark wings, a curved beak, massive. The creature landed briefly atop a snow-covered rock about 30 feet away before vanishing again into the storm. Ethan's pulse quickened. A hornbill? Impossible. There were no hornbills anywhere near Alaska. His exhausted brain had to be hallucinating. The old trappers used to warn about this too. People near death often saw things inside blizzards. Lights, voices, animals that weren't there. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut and counted to 5 before opening them again. The shape was gone. Only snow remained. He laughed weakly to himself, though the sound carried no humor. "You're losing it, Walker," he muttered. But then the wing beats returned. Closer this time. Ethan slowly lifted his head. The creature stood ahead of him once more, larger now, its black feathers dusted with snow, its enormous yellow beak cutting through the white storm like a lantern in the dark. The bird did not move. It simply stared at him, waiting. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The wind roared around them, yet somehow the creature stood perfectly still, untouched by panic, untouched by fear. Then the hornbill turned away, spread its wings, and flew several yards forward before landing again. And for the first time since the storm began, Ethan realized something that chilled him far worse than the cold ever could. The bird was not wandering through the blizzard. It was leading him somewhere. The bird waited. That was the part Ethan could not understand. Wild animals ran from storms like this. Even wolves disappeared when the mountains turned white and the air itself became deadly to breathe. But the hornbill remained perfectly still on the frozen ridge ahead of him, its dark silhouette barely visible through the spinning snow. Ethan wiped ice from his eyelashes and forced himself upright again, though his legs trembled violently beneath him. The wind pushed against his back, so hard it almost dropped him to his knees a second time. "You are not real," he whispered through chattering teeth. The bird tilted its head slightly, as if listening. Then it spread its massive wings and flew farther into the storm before landing again several yards away. Waiting again, Ethan stared at the faint shape through blurred vision. Every survival instinct told him not to follow strange sounds inside a blizzard. Lost people died that way. They chased illusions into deeper snow until exhaustion buried them forever. But another gust of freezing wind ripped through his coat and reminded him of the truth. If he stayed where he was, he would not survive the night anyway. Ethan took one slow step forward. The hornbill immediately moved farther ahead. Another step. Another movement. The creature kept the same distance between them, as if measuring his pace. Ethan could hear his heartbeat now, heavy and uneven beneath layers of frozen clothing. Snow gathered on his shoulders faster than he could brush it away. He no longer knew how long he had been wandering through the mountains. Hours maybe. Time disappeared inside storms like this. The world became only cold and motion. The hornbill disappeared briefly behind a wall of blowing snow, and panic tightened Ethan's chest. "Wait," he called instinctively, surprising himself the moment the word escaped his lips. The wind answered with a hollow scream through the trees. Then the bird reappeared again farther uphill, perched beside the broken trunk of a pine tree bent sideways beneath thick ice. Relief flooded Ethan so suddenly. It frightened him. He was beginning to depend on the creature. That realization settled heavily in his stomach. Ethan Walker had spent most of his life alone in wilderness country. He trusted maps, trails, rifles, weather reports, things that made sense. Not impossible birds appearing in frozen mountains thousands of miles from where they belonged. Yet every time the hornbill vanished into the storm, fear followed. The climb grew steeper as they moved deeper into the mountainside. Ice cracked beneath Ethan's boots. His breathing burned painfully now, each inhale sharp enough to make his chest ache. Several times he nearly stopped to rest, but every time he slowed too much, the bird returned closer, watching him silently until he moved again. It was almost guiding him by force of presence alone. Ethan stumbled over buried rocks hidden beneath the snow and crashed shoulder first into the frozen ground. Pain shot through his arm. He cursed under his breath and rolled onto his back, staring blindly upward into the white chaos overhead. Snowflakes struck his face like tiny needles. He felt suddenly very tired. Not ordinary exhaustion. Something deeper. Dangerous. The kind of tiredness that whispered peaceful things into dying minds. Just close your eyes for a minute. Just rest. Ethan's body wanted the snow now. Wanted the stillness. His eyelids drifted shut despite himself. Then came the sound. One enormous wing beat directly above him. Ethan opened his eyes sharply as the hornbill landed beside him so heavily that snow burst outward around its claws. Up close, the creature looked even stranger. Its feathers shimmered black and silver beneath the storm. Frost clung to the edges of its wings. The great yellow beak looked ancient somehow, almost carved rather than grown. But it was the eyes that unsettled Ethan most. Calm, intelligent, watching him with an almost human patience. The bird stepped closer and struck the snow once with its beak. Hard. Ethan frowned weakly. Then the hornbill struck the ground again. And again. Ethan pushed himself upright slowly, confused at first, until he noticed something ahead through the blinding snow. The ground in front of him looked smoother than the rest of the ridge. Too smooth. Wind had covered it evenly. His stomach tightened. Ethan grabbed a loose branch sticking from the drift beside him and tossed it forward. The snow collapsed instantly. A massive crack split open across the mountainside as an entire section of hidden ice gave way into darkness below. Ethan froze in horror as chunks of snow and rock vanished into the ravine beneath. He had been seconds from stepping directly onto it. The echo of falling ice disappeared into endless blackness somewhere below the mountain. Ethan slowly turned back toward the hornbill. The bird had already stepped away from the edge, waiting again, as though it had known exactly where death was hiding beneath the snow all along. Ethan could not stop staring at the ravine. Even through his blurred vision, he could see enough to understand what had almost happened. The crack stretched across the mountainside like a wound hidden beneath fresh snow, wide enough to swallow a truck whole. Loose ice continued breaking away into the darkness below, vanishing without sound beneath the screaming wind. If the Hornbill had not stopped him when it did, he would already be gone, buried somewhere deep inside the frozen mountain where nobody would ever find him. A cold heavier than the storm settled into Ethan's chest. Not fear this time. Something stranger. The bird watched him from several feet away, snow drifting across its black feathers. Then once again, without hesitation, it turned and moved farther uphill. Ethan swallowed hard and followed. The mountain grew steeper with every step. Jagged rocks rose through the snow like broken teeth, forcing Ethan to climb carefully despite the numbness spreading through his legs. His left boot had begun freezing solid around the laces. He could no longer feel 2 fingers on his right hand. Every breath came slower now, each inhale scraping painfully through his lungs. Yet somehow the Hornbill never slowed. It moved with eerie certainty through the storm, gliding between buried trees and icy ridges as if it already knew the safest path. Ethan lost sight of the creature several times whenever the wind thickened into white walls around him. Each disappearance sent panic rushing through him before the bird emerged again farther ahead. Waiting. Always waiting. The storm had erased all sense of direction hours ago, but now Ethan noticed something unsettling. The Hornbill never wandered randomly. It chose routes deliberately, avoiding unstable slopes, crossing narrow ridges where the snow packed firmer beneath his boots. Guiding him away from sounds Ethan himself barely noticed until too late. Once, the bird abruptly spread its wings and blocked his path entirely. Ethan stopped in confusion. A second later, a massive section of snow collapsed somewhere nearby with a deep, thunderous roar that shook the mountain beneath his feet. Avalanche. Ethan's heartbeat stumbled painfully inside his chest as clouds of frozen powder rolled through the trees below. He stared at the Hornbill through the swirling white haze. "How do you know?" he whispered weakly. The creature gave no answer, of course. It simply resumed moving uphill. Ethan followed in silence after that. Somewhere along the climb, the fear inside him began changing shape. At first he had followed the bird because he had no better choice. But now another thought crept into his exhausted mind. Maybe this creature truly was trying to save him. The idea sounded impossible even inside his own head. Yet every minute seemed to prove it further. The wind sharpened as daylight slowly faded behind thick storm clouds. Night was coming. Ethan understood what that meant. Temperatures would fall even lower after dark. Visibility would vanish completely. If he did not find shelter soon, the mountain would finish what the storm had started. His knees nearly buckled from exhaustion as he climbed over another ridge of ice-covered stone. The Hornbill landed atop a twisted pine tree ahead and let out a low, hollow call that echoed strangely through the storm. Ethan froze. There it was again. That sound. Not aggressive. Not frightened. Almost like a signal. He squinted through burning eyes and noticed something new beyond the drifting snow. A faint shape hidden against the mountainside. Straight lines. Dark edges beneath layers of ice. Ethan's pulse quickened painfully. A structure. He stumbled forward faster, now despite the weakness in his body. The closer he got, the clearer it became. An old hunting cabin buried nearly halfway beneath packed snow. One shutter hung broken beside a frost-covered window. The roof sagged under thick ice, but the walls still stood. Ethan could hardly breathe from relief. Shelter. Real shelter. He laughed once under his breath, the sound cracking through frozen lips. "You led me here," he whispered. The Hornbill remained perched silently above him as snow spiraled around its wings. Ethan reached the cabin door and shoved hard against it. At first nothing happened. Then the frozen wood groaned open several inches, releasing a faint gust of stale air from inside. Darkness waited beyond the doorway. But Ethan also caught another scent beneath the cold. Smoke. Very old smoke. His exhausted heart pounded harder. Someone had used this place before. Maybe not recently. Maybe not for years. But there had once been fire here. Warmth. Survival. Ethan turned back toward the Hornbill, wanting somehow to thank the creature that had brought him this far through the storm alive. But the bird was no longer on the tree. The branch sat empty beneath the falling snow. And somewhere out in the white darkness beyond the cabin, Ethan heard the heavy beat of wings moving farther into the mountains alone. The silence inside the cabin felt unnatural after hours of screaming wind. Ethan pushed the frozen door shut behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard while darkness swallowed the small room around him. For the first time since the storm began, the wind no longer tore at his face. The sudden stillness almost made him dizzy. Snow blindness continued burning behind his eyes, but he could at least make out shadows now. A broken table leaned against one wall. Rusted cans sat scattered across the floor beneath layers of dust and frost. An old cast-iron stove rested near the corner beneath a chimney pipe blackened by years of smoke. Ethan stared at it like a starving man staring at food. Fire. If he could make fire, he might survive the night. His shaking hands moved clumsily through his backpack, until he found a waterproof match case buried beneath spare ammunition and frozen rope. Only 4 matches remained. Ethan swallowed nervously. For chances. He dropped to his knees beside the stove and forced numb fingers to gather scraps of broken wood from the cabin floor. Every movement felt slower now. Heavy. His thoughts drifted strangely in and out of focus. Several times he forgot what he was doing halfway through reaching for something. The cold had settled deep inside him. He knew that much. Frostbite no longer frightened him. The dangerous part came after the pain disappeared. Ethan struck the first match. It snapped instantly between his fingers. He cursed softly under his breath and reached for another. This one caught fire with a weak hiss of orange light. Ethan shielded it carefully from the draft leaking through cracks in the cabin walls and lowered it toward the dry splinters inside the stove. For several terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then a thin curl of smoke rose upward. Tiny flames followed. Ethan nearly laughed from relief. The fire spread slowly through the old wood until faint warmth finally touched the frozen air around him. He sat back against the wall beside the stove, exhausted beyond words. Heat returned painfully to his hands first, sharp needles stabbing through his fingers as circulation slowly crawled back into them. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the crackling fire. Safe. Somehow, against every impossible chance, he had found safety. The thought barely settled into his mind before another sound interrupted it. A heavy thump outside the cabin. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. Silence followed. Then came another sound against the roof. Scraping. Slow and deliberate beneath the wind. Ethan stared upward uneasily. Snow shifted somewhere above him. He rose carefully and stepped toward the frost-covered window near the door. Through blurred vision and blowing snow, he could just barely make out the hornbill perched on the roofline outside. The bird stood facing the mountains instead of the cabin, feathers rippling violently beneath the storm winds. Watching something. Ethan frowned. "What are you doing?" he whispered. The hornbill suddenly spread its wings wide and slammed its beak hard against the roof beneath its feet. Once, twice, 3 times. Snow dropped from the ceiling inside the cabin. Ethan froze. Another crack echoed above him. Deep. Sharp. His heartbeat quickened instantly. He slowly looked upward toward the sagging roof beams overhead. Meltwater dripped quietly from the wood near the chimney. One drop. Then another. Ethan's stomach tightened with dread. The stove. The heat from the fire was warming the ice packed across the roof. Too much weight rested above them. The hornbill struck the roof again outside, louder this time. Snow cascaded from the ceiling beams. Ethan lunged toward the stove and kicked snow over the flames, but it was already too late. A low groan rolled through the cabin like the mountain itself, shifting awake. Ethan stumbled backward as the roof bent inward several inches overhead. More snow poured through widening cracks. "No," he whispered breathlessly. Another violent crack exploded above him. The entire ceiling sagged lower. Ethan ran for the door, but the floor beneath him shook suddenly beneath an avalanche of snow crashing onto the cabin roof from uphill. The impact thundered through the walls. Everything collapsed at once. Wood splintered. Ice burst downward. Ethan barely had time to throw his arms over his head before the ceiling gave way completely and the mountain came crashing into the cabin around him. The mountain buried him in silence. Ethan did not remember hitting the ground. 1 second the cabin still existed around him, groaning beneath the collapsing weight of snow and ice, and the next there was only darkness pressing against his body from every direction. His mouth filled with the bitter taste of frozen air and shattered with dust. He tried to move instinctively, but nothing happened. Snow packed around his chest and legs like solid concrete. Panic exploded through him instantly. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath, but the space around his face felt painfully tight. He could barely move enough air into his lungs. Somewhere above him, the storm continued roaring across the mountain, muffled now beneath layers of snow and debris. The sound felt distant, unreal. Ethan forced himself to stay still. Trappers taught one rule above all others about avalanches and cave-ins. Panic killed faster than cold. He shut his eyes tightly and focused on breathing slowly despite the crushing fear building inside him. Inhale, exhale, small breaths. The darkness around him felt complete. His snow blindness made it impossible to tell whether his eyes were open or closed anymore. He tested his arms carefully. His left arm remained pinned beneath heavy beams, but his right hand moved several inches through packed snow before striking broken wood. Pain pulsed through his shoulders sharply enough to remind him he was still alive. For now, Ethan swallowed hard. The air already felt thinner. He understood the danger immediately. Snow trapped oxygen poorly inside buried spaces. If he stayed trapped too long, the mountain would suffocate him before the cold ever could. He tried shouting once. Help! The word barely escaped his throat before packed snow absorbed the sound completely. Nobody could hear him out here. Nobody even knew where he was. A wave of hopelessness rolled through him so heavily that he nearly stopped fighting right there. The storm had finally won. His thoughts drifted strangely as exhaustion deepened around him like water pulling him under. He thought about his father teaching him to hunt in Montana when he was 12 years old. The smell of pine smoke during winter mornings. Coffee heating beside old campfires. Warm hands. Warm sunlight. Ethan realized with sudden horror that he could no longer feel his feet at all. Then came the sound. Faint at first. Scratch. Scratch. Ethan's eyes opened immediately. He held his breath and listened harder. The sound came again somewhere above him. Claws scraping against wood and packed snow. Ethan's pulse quickened painfully. No way, he whispered weakly. More scratching followed, faster this time. Then a heavy thump directly overhead. Snow shifted above his trapped body. Ethan stared upward into darkness he could not see through. Hey, he croaked desperately. Hey. The scratching intensified instantly after his voice. Snow trickled onto his face from somewhere near his shoulder. Ethan's chest tightened with disbelief. The Hornbill. The creature was still there. Outside in the storm. Digging. Time lost meaning after that. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness while the sounds above him continued without stopping. Claw scraping. Wings beating heavily against snow. Sharp strikes from the great beak breaking through frozen debris. Again and again. Every few minutes loose snow shifted enough for tiny streams of freezing air to slip through into the pocket around his face. The bird was keeping him alive. Ethan laughed weakly through cracked lips at the impossible thought. A tropical bird surviving an Alaskan blizzard while trying to rescue a dying hunter trapped beneath a mountain. None of it made sense anymore. Yet the sounds continued. Persistent. Determined. At one point, everything fell silent for several terrifying minutes. Ethan's heartbeat slowed as despair crept back into him. Maybe the creature had finally given up. Maybe it had flown away at last. Then suddenly a shaft of pale gray light pierced through the darkness above him. Ethan blinked painfully against it. Fresh air rushed into the cramped space around his face. He gasped sharply, coughing hard as icy oxygen filled his lungs again. Snow collapsed away from his shoulder as a dark shape appeared above the opening. The Hornbill stared down at him through blowing snow, feathers coated white with ice. Ethan could hardly believe what he was seeing. The bird looked exhausted. Its wings trembled slightly beneath the storm winds. Yet it had not abandoned him. Ethan reached upward slowly with his free hand toward the opening. Why? He whispered hoarsely. The Hornbill gave a low hollow call in response before stepping backward from the hole. Ethan frowned weakly. Then he heard it. A deep cracking sound rolling somewhere across the mountain outside. Not thunder. Ice. Something enormous shifting beneath the storm. The Hornbill spread its wings immediately, turning its head sharply toward the sound. And for the first time since Ethan met the creature, fear appeared in its eyes. The Hornbill did not hesitate. The moment the deep cracking sound rolled across the mountain again, it spread its wings wide and launched itself into the storm above the broken cabin roof, disappearing for a brief second into the white chaos. Ethan, still half buried beneath snow and shattered wood, forced his head toward the opening and tried to follow its movement through the narrow gap of sky he could barely see. The wind outside had changed. It was no longer just wind. It was movement in the mountain itself, a shifting pressure that made every frozen tree groan in the distance. Ethan did not understand what he was sensing, but his body understood before his mind did. Something above the slope had begun to give way. He pulled weakly against the snow, trapping his chest, but it barely moved. His breath came in short, controlled bursts now, each one colder than the last. The hornbill reappeared at the edge of the opening, lowering itself closer to him again. For a moment it simply stared, and in that stare Ethan felt something that was not panic, not instinct, but urgency. The bird struck the edge of the broken wood above him once with its beak, then again, loosening compacted snow that fell in small sheets around Ethan's shoulders. He coughed as the air space widened slightly. "I am here," he whispered without thinking, as if speaking to something that could understand him beyond language. The hornbill responded by stepping backward again into the storm. Ethan hesitated. Every survival instinct he had left told him that moving now, buried and half-blind, was almost impossible. But staying still was no longer an option either. The mountain outside had begun to sound different, a low rolling tension that traveled through the ground itself. Ethan gathered every remaining ounce of strength in his body and pushed upward. The snow gave slightly this time, as if weakened from above. Above him, the hornbill continued digging, striking, and shifting debris with relentless precision. Small amounts of daylight began filtering through the broken opening. Ethan gasped as colder air rushed in, sharper but freer. The pressure on his chest eased by a fraction. He forced his arm through the gap the bird had created, scraping against frozen wood, pulling himself inch by inch toward the surface. Each movement sent waves of exhaustion through him, but the alternative was staying trapped forever beneath collapsing snow. The hornbill suddenly lifted its head and turned sharply toward the mountainside beyond the cabin. Its entire body stiffened. Ethan froze mid-movement. A second later, the sound came again. Not close this time. Farther uphill. A deep, resonating crack that traveled through layers of ice and stone. The hornbill made a low call, then abruptly stopped digging. It looked back at Ethan once more, and in that instant he understood something without explanation. The creature was not only trying to free him, it was reacting to something larger than this collapse, something still moving through the mountain above them. Ethan pulled himself partially out of the broken structure, collapsing onto the snow just outside the cabin entrance. His body trembled violently as he tried to stand. The hornbill landed beside him immediately, then turned and began moving uphill once more. Faster now, no longer waiting. Ethan staggered after it instinctively. The storm had not weakened. If anything, it felt more violent the higher they climbed. Snow whipped across the slope in dense sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing again. Ethan followed the faint shape of the bird whenever it appeared between gusts of white. At one point the ground beneath them shifted subtly, a slow settling motion that made Ethan stop instantly. The hornbill stopped too. They both remained still for several seconds. Then the sound came again. Closer. Stronger. The hornbill spread its wings fully and let out a sharp call that echoed strangely through the storm. It was no longer guiding. It was warning. Ethan felt it in his bones before he saw anything. The mountain was not just storming. It was moving. Snow from higher elevations began sliding in thin layers across the slope, not yet an avalanche, but unstable enough to signal danger beneath the surface. Ethan looked at the hornbill as it took flight again, circling once above him before heading higher into the blizzard. He understood then that stopping was not an option. Not anymore. With trembling legs and fading strength, Ethan forced himself to continue upward, following the last visible shadow of the bird as it disappeared into the white storm ahead, deeper into whatever force had begun waking inside the mountain itself. The wind no longer felt like weather. It felt like pressure moving through the bones of the mountain itself, as if something far larger than a storm had begun to wake beneath the frozen surface. Ethan Walker struggled forward with each step, his legs trembling so violently he could barely recognize his own movement. The hornbill was ahead of him, not waiting now, but pushing forward through the wideout with sharp urgency. It no longer paused between movements. It cut through the storm in straight, deliberate bursts, vanishing and reappearing like a signal Ethan had to keep up with or lose forever. Ethan's breath came in short, painful bursts. His lungs burned with cold air that felt sharper than glass. Snow clung to his eyelashes, melting and freezing again in cycles that blurred what little vision he still had. The world had become a collapsing tunnel of white noise and instinct. Every direction looked the same. Every sound was swallowed instantly. Yet the Hornbill's presence anchored him like a distant pulse in the storm. Suddenly, the bird stopped. It landed on a narrow ridge of ice barely wide enough to stand on. Ethan slowed as well, stumbling the final steps until he reached the same ridge. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was no immediate movement ahead. Only silence beneath the wind. The Hornbill turned its head slowly, scanning the slope below them. Ethan followed its gaze. At first he saw nothing but shifting snow. Then he noticed it. A subtle wave moving through the mountainside, not falling, not breaking, but sliding internally, as if the mountain itself had loosened its grip on the ground beneath them. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had seen avalanches before, but this was different. This movement was deeper, slower, almost hidden beneath layers of compressed ice. The Hornbill gave a low call, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the wind. Ethan felt it immediately in his chest. Warning. The bird stepped back from the ridge and pushed forward again, urging him to move. Ethan obeyed without thinking. He forced his body onward just as the ground beneath the ridge shifted slightly, a soft settling that sent a cold shock through his entire frame. They moved quickly now, climbing higher along the unstable slope. Ethan no longer had the strength to question anything. His survival had narrowed to one simple truth. Follow the bird or stop breathing. The Hornbill led him toward a line of jagged stone protruding through the snow, guiding him along its edge where the wind seemed slightly less violent. Ethan used it as cover, pressing his body against the rock whenever he could to regain even a fraction of strength. At one point, he slipped and nearly fell backward down the slope, but the Hornbill dropped instantly from above, landing hard enough in front of him to force him to stop. Ethan froze. The space beneath his foot collapsed seconds later, revealing a hidden drop beneath a thin layer of snow. He stared at it in disbelief, his heart pounding violently in his chest. Without the bird, he would have fallen through it without even knowing. The Hornbill did not linger. It turned again and continued upward. Ethan followed. The storm intensified the higher they climbed. Snow no longer fell in flakes, but in dense, horizontal sheets that erased distance entirely. Ethan could barely see the Hornbill now, only catching fragments of its movement between bursts of white. At times, he had to rely purely on sound, the faint beating of wings ahead of him guiding his direction. Then, without warning, the sound changed. A deep rumble rolled through the mountain. Not above them. Below. Ethan stopped instantly. The Hornbill stopped as well, perched on a fractured stone pillar partially buried in ice. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The rumble grew stronger, traveling through the ground like a living pulse. Ethan's breath caught. This was not weather anymore. It was structural failure deep within the mountain system. Something large was shifting beneath them, destabilizing everything above. The Hornbill spread its wings wide and let out a call. Unlike anything Ethan had heard before, it echoed across the storm in a way that felt almost unnatural, as if it was answering something hidden inside the mountain itself. Ethan looked at the bird and felt a sudden, overwhelming realization. The creature was not only reacting to danger, it was responding to it. The Hornbill launched into the air again, flying higher into the white chaos without hesitation. Ethan hesitated only for a second before forcing himself to follow once more, climbing toward whatever lay beyond the breaking mountain and the storm that refused to end. The Hornbill flew low over the broken edge of the mountain, cutting through the storm like a shadow that refused to be erased. Ethan Walker followed behind it, every step becoming more unstable as the slope narrowed into a dangerous ridge of ice and fractured stone. The wind screamed harder here, as if the storm itself was trying to push him backward, away from whatever waited ahead. His legs no longer felt like part of his body. They moved only because stopping meant disappearing into the cold. The Hornbill did not slow. It moved with a strange certainty, landing briefly on narrow points of stone before launching forward again. Each movement forced Ethan to make a choice without time to think. Follow or fall behind. The world around him had become a collapsing corridor of white, with no sense of distance, no sense of direction, only motion and survival. Then the Hornbill stopped again. This time it did not land on stone or snow. It hovered for a moment in the air, wings beating against the storm with visible effort, before descending toward a narrow break in the mountainside ahead. Ethan squinted through the blizzard and saw it. A long fracture in the rock face, partially hidden beneath layers of snow and ice. The Hornbill disappeared into it without hesitation. Ethan hesitated only for a second before following. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to pass through. He pressed himself sideways against the cold rock, feeling the rough surface scrape against his frozen coat as he forced his way inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the wind outside faded into a distant roar. Inside the narrow passage, the air was still cold, but it was no longer violent. Ethan leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, trying to understand where he had been led. The Hornbill was already deeper inside, moving through the fractured tunnel with controlled steps. Ethan followed slowly, his hands brushing against ice that lined the stone like frozen glass. The passage twisted downward slightly, leading them into a space that felt less like natural formation and more like something shaped by time and pressure over centuries. Then Ethan heard it again, that same deep rumble from before. But here, inside the mountain, it sounded closer, stronger. The Hornbill stopped instantly. Ethan froze behind it. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then the entire tunnel seemed to vibrate. Tiny cracks appeared in the ice along the walls, spreading slowly like veins under pressure. Ethan's breath quickened. Something was shifting again, but this time it was not above them or below them. It was all around them. The Hornbill turned sharply, letting out a sharp call that echoed down the tunnel ahead. Then it moved forward at speed. Ethan followed immediately. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, carved naturally between layers of stone and ice. Light filtered faintly through cracks high above, revealing unstable formations hanging like frozen waves. The Hornbill landed at the far side of the chamber and turned back toward Ethan. For the first time, it did not continue forward immediately. It waited. Ethan stopped in the center of the chamber, his chest rising and falling heavily. The air here felt different, heavier, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then the Hornbill suddenly lifted its head toward the ceiling. A low grinding sound rolled through the chamber. Ethan looked up just as fine lines of fracture spread across the ice above them. Slowly at first, then faster. Ethan's body reacted before his mind fully understood. He stepped backward instinctively, but the chamber was already changing. The Hornbill launched upward, flying toward a narrow opening near the top of the chamber wall. Ethan realized instantly that this was not an exit he could simply walk toward. It was a climb. He searched for anything to hold on to, finding jagged edges of stone barely exposed through the ice. The structure around them was becoming unstable, not collapsing violently, but shifting slowly, like the mountain itself was breathing out. Ethan began climbing, using whatever strength remained in his body. Every movement felt delayed, as if his mind and limbs were no longer synchronized. Above him, the Hornbill circled once, then landed on a ledge just beneath the opening, calling down to him repeatedly. The urgency in its movements was unmistakable now. Ethan pulled himself upward inch by inch, ignoring the pain spreading through his frozen hands. When he finally reached the ledge, he collapsed against the stone, gasping for air. The Hornbill stood beside the opening, looking out into the white storm beyond. Ethan followed its gaze and saw something he had not seen before. Not a path, not a shelter, but a vast open drop beyond the mountain ridge where the storm seemed to disappear into nothingness. A space so wide and so empty it felt like the edge of the world itself. The Hornbill turned back to him once more, wings half spread, as the mountain behind them began to groan again, deeper this time, as if something far larger was about to shift beneath everything they had crossed so far. The Hornbill stood at the edge of the ledge, its wings half open against the violent wind that still roared through the mountain behind them. Ethan Walker struggled to lift his head, his body shaking from exhaustion that had gone far beyond physical limits. Every breath felt thinner now, as if the air itself was slowly fading from the world. The opening ahead of them was not a path in the normal sense. It was a vast fracture in the mountainside, a place where the storm seemed to dissolve into an endless white void stretching beyond sight. For a moment, Ethan could not understand what he was looking at. It did not feel like an escape route. It felt like the edge of reality itself. The Hornbill turned its head slowly toward him. There was no urgency now, no frantic movement. Only a steady presence, as if everything they had endured had been leading to this exact point. Ethan pushed himself up with trembling arms, forcing his frozen body to move despite every instinct telling him to collapse. His legs barely responded. His hands felt like they belonged to someone else. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood beside the Hornbill at the edge of the ledge. The wind here was different. It did not push against him as violently as before. Instead, it felt distant, muffled, as if the storm had been left behind on the other side of the mountain. Ethan looked down into the white expanse below and realized there was no clear ground, no visible path, only layers of drifting snow stretching outward into emptiness. The Hornbill suddenly spread its wings fully. For a brief moment, it held that position, as if waiting for something unseen to respond. Ethan's breathing slowed without him realizing it. The exhaustion inside him no longer felt like something chasing him. It felt like something releasing its grip. Then the Hornbill moved. It stepped forward off the ledge and launched into the open space beyond the mountain. Ethan's heart jumped instantly. But instead of falling, the bird glided forward, carried by winds that were invisible yet steady, moving across currents that could not be seen but could clearly be felt. It circled once in the distance, then continued forward through the white void. Ethan stared in disbelief. There was no ground beneath it, no visible structure, yet it was moving as if the air itself had become a path. A slow realization formed in Ethan's mind. This was not escape in the way he had understood it before. It was passage, a transition through something that could not be measured or defined by the mountain anymore. The Hornbill turned midair and looked back at him one last time, not as a guide forcing him forward, but as something confirming that the choice was his now. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The memories of everything he had endured rushed through him in fragments. The storm, the silence, the impossible guidance through collapsing ice and hidden danger. Every moment that should have ended him but did not. He opened his eyes again. The ledge beneath him was still there, but everything beyond it felt different now. Not empty, not dangerous, simply unknown. Ethan stepped forward. The moment his foot left the stone, he did not fall. Instead, the wind caught him in a way that felt almost deliberate, stabilizing his body as he moved forward into the open air. It was not flight in any literal sense, but something between falling and being carried. The storm behind him began to fade as he moved farther from the mountain. The Hornbill flew beside him now, close enough that he could see the frost still clinging to its feathers. For the first time since the storm began, Ethan felt something that was not fear, not exhaustion, not survival instinct. It was silence inside his mind, a vast stillness that replaced everything else. Below them, the mountain that had nearly claimed him was now distant, swallowed by white clouds and shifting winds. Ahead, the void of snow and sky stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like continuation. The Hornbill let out one final call, softer than before, carried across the wind like a signal fading into distance. Ethan did not know how long he drifted through that space, or where exactly the wind carried him, but at some point, the feeling of falling changed into something else entirely. When the storm finally began to thin, and the light beyond